Good evening, and welcome to the Celeste Bartos Forum at the New York Public Library. My name is Betsy Bradley, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's conversation with Margaret Atwood and Marilyn French. As many of you know, this event was to have taken place last September, and I am exceptionally grateful to both of this evening's speakers for their patience and encouragement as we plotted and planned how best to reschedule, and I'm delighted that you're both here tonight. I'll begin with Ms. Atwood. Margaret Atwood is a novelist, short story writer, poet, and literary critic. Her novels include Alias Grace, The Handmaid's Tale, Cat's Eye, The Robber Bride, and most recently Blind Assassin, for which she was awarded the Booker Prize for 2000. Blind Assassin has also been shortlisted for the 2002 Impact Dublin Award. Ms. Atwood is also celebrated for her collections of short stories such as Wilderness Tips, Bluebeard's Egg and Other Stories, and Good Bones, as well as her poems, which include the collections Journals of Susanna Moody and Morning in the Burned House. The tremendous honesty and power of Ms. Atwood's writing, which moves with confidence and elegance from intimate scenes to sweeping socio-political themes, has garnered her a host of awards, including, and this is a very abbreviated selection, trust me on this, the Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, a Medal of Honor from the National Arts Club here in New York, the Los Angeles Times Fiction Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and I like this one best, the Norwegian Order of Literary Merit. We're very pleased that she can be here with us tonight. And I'm also delighted to welcome Marilyn French to the library. Ms. French is a novelist and feminist critic whose works include The Women's Room, a nationally best-selling novel which has been hailed as a seminal text of the women's movement, as well as Beyond Power on Men, Women, and Morals, Her Mother's Daughter, and the War Against Women. Ms. French has taught at Hofstra University, the College of Holy Cross, and Harvard University, where she was a Mellon Fellow. Her most recent work is A Season in Hell, a memoir, a clear-eyed and compelling account of her victory over cancer, and we're very glad to have her here this evening as well. At the conclusion of their conversation, our speakers will take some questions from the audience. As you know the drill, we have microphones to the left and right of the stage, and I hope you'll use them for your questions so that everybody can hear you. And now, please join me in welcoming Margaret Atwood and Marilyn French.
We're very happy to see you here, Margaret.
And I'm happy to see you.
I think a lot of Americans don't realize that Canada is a separate country. I think a lot of us think of it as a sort of chillier United States. Would you tell us how you see Canada as a discrete and a symbolic place?
Well, of course, just to begin, we're still in mourning for the Queen Mum. She's our Queen Mum too. You may not have known this, but the Queen of England is also the Queen of Canada. This did inspire one of my friends to do a series of portraits of our dear Queen in her Canadian guise, seated side saddle on a moose. The series is called Queen on a Moose. So there is that connection. We are part of the Commonwealth still, such as it is. I think you'd have to go back in history to sort of trace it through to see how all of this came about. But in fact, I was picked up at the Minneapolis airport last week by somebody who happens to be related to me. I didn't know this. And how are they related? They're from Nova Scotia. So they were part of those people, as my ancestors were as well, who left the United States either just before the American Revolution or during the American Revolution or just after the American Revolution, at which point they were political refugees. And I sometimes like to tease people here by saying, of course, my ancestors were political refugees, and they say, oh, what Middle European country were they from? Say, well, actually, they were from here. Oh, what? Shock, horror. So there is that. Number two, if you hear a second language here, it's most likely Spanish. If you hear a second language there, it's most likely French. because a quarter of the country is, in fact, Francophone. And this has all kinds of ramifications, political and cultural, and having to do with cuisine. So all of those kinds of differences. I think the ethnic mix is somewhat different as well. We say the Irish went to the States and the Scots went to Canada. Of course, some of each went to either place, but you got more of the Irish and we got more of the Scots, and that is why you had who was that guy? Bing Crosby. You know? All of those Irish lullabies and sentimental Irish songs, and we got the guys in the kilts with the drums. So, but we're not responsible for Braveheart. You did that.
No, strictly a Southern invention, that. But Canada has its own discrete character in your work, and particularly in certain novels like Surfacing, where it's very important, the earlier ones maybe. But even in Blind Assassin, it's a special place.
It is further north. But on the other hand, if you go to Alaska, you will find, actually, if you go to Alaska, you'll find people who say two things. One of them is, we ought to be Canadians. And the other is Alaska, where the women are men and the men are animals.
Well, you've partly answered my next question. In our country, we have a very firm grasp of the stereotypes, all stereotypes. So we know if a piece of work is set in the South, or in New England, or in Miami, we know what to expect. We know what the unwritten connotations are. But when I'm reading a Canadian novel, and I read quite a few of them, since you have a lot of good writers, something set in Vancouver, the Maritime Provinces, I don't know the meanings of these places. I do get the meaning of the far north. So as far as the Alaskans are concerned, I think I probably have a pretty good grasp. And of the north part of Quebec, I have some sense from having read Marie-Claire Blais. But I don't know. You, for instance, will sometimes have a character go from Toronto to Vancouver. What does that mean to you?
Going from Toronto to Vancouver? Well, at the time I did it, it meant getting as far away from Toronto as I could get without actually falling into the sea. I was not feeling very cozy towards Toronto at that moment in time, and I was very happy to go to Vancouver. So it was the great escape, and to some extent at that time, which was 1964, and of course you always have to situate these things in time because everything changes, as you know, from decade to decade, and things shift around. But at that time it was a small, it was a seaport, and there weren't very many tall buildings, and it was very into cults. You know, cults of all different kinds.
Is it now?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Things sweep through. All of a sudden, everybody will be doing Rolfing, or else.
So it's like California for us.
Well, but rainier. It's sort of like Seattle for you, only sunnier.
I've been there, and it's very beautiful. I didn't notice the cults.
You must have been there on a beautiful day. Because there can be weeks of gray, foggy rain. But when I was there, I was 24 years old and the lowest person on the university totem pole. So I was so low that people didn't even bother involving me in their faculty fights. It just went right over my head. So I had a good time, but I watched them all. They were very badly behaved. And I was given, of course, the lowest of the low jobs. And one of those was teaching English grammar to engineering students. at 8:30 in the morning in a Quonset hut. They still had Quonset huts. They hadn't, it was that close to the war. But we got on quite well. We were all asleep, that was fine. And I taught them Kafka. I had them do little imitations of Kafka parables, nice and short, contained a puzzle. They liked that part, and they could do that. And I've always felt that it must have been a help to them in their future lives. I think so.
I'm sure. I wonder if any of them ever tried to build that machine that etches your sin upon your body.
Well, in some version or another, they may have done that. It's the penal colony, which I've always thought is a novel way of teaching reading, because the sentence got engraved on you until finally there was a moment of enlightenment, after which you died.
Reviewers, it seems to me, both men and women, almost never find a woman's novel political, with the exception of the Handmaid's Tale and maybe Edible Woman. I don't remember the reviews for Edible Woman, so I don't know.
I'll tell you about them.
They never refer to the politics in your novel. How do you feel about that?
Well, some of them do, but unfavorably. And others do. But when the things first come out, of course, those I suppose would be the reviews. I wrote The Edible Woman in '64 in this very same Vancouver on University of British Columbia exam booklets. You know those exam booklets with the lines? Well, one booklet per chapter. And then the Canadian publisher lost it for 4 years or so, which is why it didn't come out until 1969. So between '64 and '69, there was a sea change, namely that which had been read only in the bathroom, such as the feminine mystique and the second sex, and not admitted to at parties, suddenly became something you could discuss, and there was the women's movement. And I remember when the women's movement began, because I was in Edmonton, Alberta, where I can tell you there was no women's movement. But people were still wearing white socks and wedgies, not because they'd come back into style, because I'd never gone out. I had a bad 2 years, but a friend of mine in New York wrote me and told me about this thing and sent me that article, which you will remember, called Housework is Work. Okay. Then The Edible Women came out in 1969, and it was reviewed by two kinds of people: those who had heard of the women's movement having begun, and those who had not. And those who had not said this was a novel by a young writer who was confused and would mature later and come into her right mind, develop a more mature attitude. And the ones who had were, on the other hand, made rather nervous by it. So I also had my first interviews at that time, which included an interview in which somebody asked me, however did I manage to write and do the housework too at the same time? At which point I said, look under the bed. Where the giant monster dust bunny is living. And another man who said quite famously, in a nervous way, do men like you? I said, ask them. I don't know, which men? That later modulated into, do you like men? At which point I said the same thing, which men? Not too fond of Hitler. Albert Schweitzer, on the other hand, is quite nice. So all of that began right then, and I also did my first book signing ever. It was, for some reason that's never become clear to me, it really was in the men's sock and underwear department of the Hudson's Bay Company in Edmonton, Alberta. It was the publicist's first week on the job. I don't know why they put it there, but there I was with my table and a little stack of edible women, smiling hopefully at all of the guys who were coming in to buy their underwear and socks at lunchtime. How many did I sell? 2.
3.
a lot of nervous galoshes, footed, scuttling the other way.
You remind me of a British journalist who came to interview me once. She picked me up I was at my hairdresser. He cut my hair in his apartment. His apartment had never been dusted. I don't know how long he'd lived there, but many, many years. But it was very elaborate and beautiful and rich, but it was very dusty. Then she came back to my apartment, which is very, very clean. I got 2 reviews in this one review. One was this filthy, dusty hairdresser's apartment, and second was this disgustingly clean my apartment.
You can't win.
I didn't know what kind of grade I got on housework.
Well, I don't let them into the house anymore. And the reason I don't let them into the house, among other things, never mind the breakfast dishes, but some of the furniture in it is actually Graham's grandfather's furniture. And I do not wish to have, because they do review your furniture and think, and think that it means some things about your personality. And I don't really wish to come out with the personality of this dead old man who lived in the 19th century. So I just don't let them in. I let them in sometimes if they're from foreign countries. I once had a French one, and we sat in the backyard, and the first and only time it ever happened, a groundhog ran across the lawn, and he was thrilled. He said, "Ah, voilà! Un animal sauvage! Les animaux du Canada!" He was just absolutely thrilled. But the other time I let a British one into the backyard. This is quite bad. It was The Robber Bride, a somewhat Gothic work. No, it was Alias Grace, even worse. And there he was, and there was a sick robin that had flown into a window or something. And Graham emerged from a shrub somewhere and found this robin lying on the lawn, and he did what you and I would do. Or maybe you wouldn't. You have to collapse their lungs by squeezing gently. If you cannot bring them back to health, you must dispatch them quite quickly, and that is the way to do it. So he did this, and here's this British journalist watching. So the beginning of the interview is out from the shadows, strangling a robin.
From the British, who build tunnels across their roads so that the toads can get across.
Yeah, he was being mischievous, as well we know. And they will do that given any opportunity.
So how do you feel about not being called political?
Well, you know, I am called political quite a bit. In Canada, they think I'm sort of Red Emma, with various other people thrown in. Not because of particularly women, although if you go back into the 70s, a lot of it is about that. But a lot about positions I've taken about Canadian politics of various kinds.
But that's in interviews.
Interviews, in reviews, political. Yeah, political. They do that too there. They even do it some in England. I think they tend to do it less here because political has 2 meanings. One is it's about Washington. You know, the political novel is about politicians and what they do. And it's like Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil, you know, that's a political novel. It's about politics and the way they all go about it. And the other meaning is the person has opinions, you know? It's not just entertainment. And in any country other than the United States, if you're talking with young writers and ask them why they write and things, whatnot, other places in the world, they will usually come out with an answer that has to do with their relationship to their society in some form or another. Here, they're more likely to say, it's for me, it's for my soul, it's for my inner being.
Yes, it's individual.
It's self-expression, it's individual.
I think what I'm getting at here is how, in general, feminism is not seen as a political stance, which I think is very strange. When, now not reviewers so much as literary critics discuss political novels, they usually mean socialist. They don't see feminism as a political stance.
How did they see it here?
As a pain in the neck.
Pain in the neck, yes. Well, they see it that way there too, but with add-ons. And there is, for instance, in Quebec had a very strong feminist movement. That might surprise you, but they came out of a situation in which they were very, very dominated by the church, and suddenly in the 60s, that all just went poof, and it was in the early 60s. And a lot of these very strong feminists came from families in which the mother had had 16 kids. You know, and they'd grown up living with that and being expected to do that, and they were just saying, no, we're not going to live our lives that way, we've seen it. And they were much stronger than the Anglophones in that way. So there are some surprises. It depends partly also where you are in the world, what the feminism thing means.
Yeah.
For instance, I was in India and I was talking to some women, and they said, we have no interest whatsoever in any kind of thing that says you can't wear makeup or pretty saris or any of that kind of thing. We aren't interested in that. What we are interested in is getting jobs for very poor women, which gives them dignity within the family, more autonomy than they have ever had. So they were not interested in the decorative art side of any of that. They were interested in the economic side. And I think here a stereotype was created which said, you know, feminists are people who don't have any sense of humor. We've all heard that light bulb joke.
What was it?
You've never heard the light bulb joke?
I don't think so.
How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny.
Okay.
We've heard that. Or, you know, you have to wear overalls, or, you know, all of those kinds of things. Or that what it means is you can't ever say bad things about women because you have to have the solidarity, and that means actually ignoring real life quite a bit. Because, I don't know about you, but not every woman that I have ever known has been an angel of light.
Really?
They have their little quirks.
You have often broken the taboo. The heroines, well, yes, heroines have to be sweet and lovable. I mean, even if they're nasty or even if they're prostitutes, you really have to find them appealing. And then you go write something like Alias Grace.
Well, I thought she was quite appealing, but then
She was very appealing to me, but
I have curious tastes. Well, I think women are people, and that is the fundamental, that's where I take my stand. Women are people. They shouldn't be expected to be more angelic than anybody else, nor should they be expected to be, you know, less human than those other kinds of people. They're human beings with a twist, but they're human beings. And you, Marilyn, you are just a little bit older than me. So you probably actually had a more horrible time than I did.
Well, we could compare, but...
Well, I think probably because talking to people who were coming of age, in the late 40s, not a lot of fun. Do you remember Generation of Vipers? Do you remember that Philip Wiley book?
Well, I mentioned it recently in an interview. I was saying that out comes these books, Generation of Vipers, and he wrote another one, Philip Wiley.
What was the other one?
I don't remember the name of it, but what his thesis was American men were being destroyed. They were all being turned into homosexuals, and it was all their mother's fault. Then, of course, shortly after that, mothers caused schizophrenia, mothers caused autism, mothers caused just about every disease there was. Women thronged to buy these books, which I read them.
You read them?
I did. I wanted to find what was wrong with us.
Oh, yes. And now you could fix it.
Now I know.
Now you know. Well, I, on the other hand, grew up in a household of scientists, so I was reading books called things like Rats, Lice, and History. It's about plagues. So, although we were interested in what was wrong with things, we had a very broad view what was wrong with everything, not just women.
A political or a feminist writer almost has, it seems to me, to write in her novel a running commentary on the literature of the past. And you do that terrifically and all the time. Care to discuss that a little bit?
I'd never actually thought about it, but of course, if you read a lot, you're very conscious of what you call people in your books, what their names are, for instance. And also, if you go back far enough, you can see that the styles of heroine change. The styles of hero change as well, but the heroines changed, as in painting, really quite a lot. They changed quite radically from age to age. You'd be interested to know also that styles in women's first names are much more changeable than styles in men's first names.
Right.
People who study these things and count them. I don't know. It's not that literature of the past is without feisty heroines. Somebody wrote a very good piece on Chaucer, in which he or she, and I forget which it was talking about the fact that in Chaucer, you get everything. You get all kinds of women, you get all kinds of language, you get all kinds of stories, and then something shut down. First of all, they started censoring literature once it began to be printed in printing presses. Censorship stepped in, and they censored plays before that, which is why there is so little actual swearing in Shakespeare. Religious swearing was not permitted. But that wife of Bath kind of character, living her life, financially independent, quite raucous, rather disrespectful, very forthright in her manner of expression. That disappeared from literature probably until about the 20th century.
Because the laws changed, making the wife of Bath impossible. She couldn't own her own property.
Yeah, that too. But also, people were less likely to write about her except as, forget the economic side, but except as a secondary character, a kind of Dickens funny person. Or, in England, if you were very rich and you happened to have inherited in a certain way, you could be Miss Havisham.
Yeah.
She owned her own property.
Only because she never married.
You got it.
When I talk about you using literature of the past, I don't mean you do a kind of deconstructive use of, say, Dickens or whatever. I mean, you include many different genres with which women, especially those with which women are associated, like romance, in your novels as a kind of collage. You use different kinds of literature. I feel you're commenting on those literatures, but maybe you have another intention.
I think you can't help but be commenting on them if you... It is like a collage, and that's exactly what a collage does. It takes one kind of representation, it sticks it on the canvas, it puts another kind of representation over and around the first one, and then it puts a frame around it. And so each kind, say if you glue newspaper onto a canvas and then paint on it, the painting and the print are both a representation of reality, but they're very different. And they both cancel out each other and comment on each other. So you've got two levels of reality going on at the same time. Somebody else who does this, although in not a very obvious way, is Alice Munro in her book, The Lives of Girls and Women. Because in each of those chapters in the book, the young girl is reading something, reading some kind of print. You know, it might be something like the National Enquirer, or it might be romances she gets at the library, or it might be the musical that they're putting on at school. And for a while, she wonders whether that is reality, and whether that is reality. And then something happens in real life that undercuts it, but doesn't cancel it out. Both of the things exist at the same time. It's very interesting to watch that. And at the end, the young girl is writing her own first novel, which is a young girl's first novel with many extremes in it. It's called The Photographer. And the photographer comes to town, and he's quite sinister. And he takes pictures of people, and the people of whom he takes the pictures have sinister things happen to them after that. And when the pictures are developed, all of their eyes are blank. And the young girl, of course, thinks this is a wonderful new literary thing that she's just done. But it ends with her, as an adult, making lists of real things. So I think what we're coming around to is, what is it when you're writing fiction? Are you representing reality? Are you going into the life of the imagination? How do those things overlap? If you imagine yourself as a helpless heroine on the run, are you going to become one? On the other hand, if you imagine yourself as Scarlett O'Hara tearing down the curtains and making them into an evening gown and saying, tomorrow is another day, is that going to give you fortitude? These are open questions. But I think people do tend to, and it's not just books, it's women's magazines, it's what you see on the television. You are always, well, you read Philip Wiley. You're always comparing yourself with representations of how other people think you are or ought to be.
And does this relate to your use of myth and archetype in your work?
It's something I've always found fascinating. My position in relation to all of this comparing and things is that I grew up outside it. I grew up north. My mother was in no way interested in any of the things I've just described. She loved being up north because there were no vacuum cleaners. There was no electricity. She wore trousers all the time. She wanted something to eat for dinner. She went down to the dock and caught a fish. You know, this was not tea parties. It was not the social life. It was not urban. It was none of those. And I wasn't really brought up in a way that said, little girls must do this, little boys, on the other hand, do that. So that when I encountered all of this and people's ideas, most of the time I just thought they were bizarre. It was anthropology. Now, my high school was like
many of my friends and I too when we reached an age when we were supposed to behave like adults, did not have any idea what it meant to be a woman, because we were not raised by mothers who insisted that we wear white gloves to dinner and so forth. My friend read women's magazines. I'm wondering if you did.
Women's magazines?
Yes.
She
tried to learn how to be a woman. That's what she told me.
Oh, well, I read True Trash magazines, but I thought they were hilarious. They were supposed to be. I read women's magazines. They puzzled me quite a lot, because it was the age when there were a number of things you couldn't print, including the true nature of products that you were advertising. So one of my most surreal moments as a child was the Modess ad, which had a woman in an evening gown.
Do you remember they used to have 3 little dolls in descending order? And I would say, I'd be fascinated by these dolls. And I'd say, Mom, what are those dolls for? What is this product? What is this?
Never mind.
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, the Modess ads were women,
She knew.
very glamorous women, rather surrealist looking, with floating draperies and blue sea in the background.
Yes, they were really fascinating.
And all it said was Modess ... because. So he said, because what? And then there were, the Kotex ads. And they were quite interesting because they told little stories. They told little stories about social situations you might encounter that might be difficult, such as, what do you do when you go to the prom and your hands are glowing? Your hands are sweaty. Do you wear gloves, put talcum powder on them, wipe them on your date's jacket, or what? And there are little squares that you could check. And the fourth one was always about this product that nobody would say what it was. And it was for those days. And I had no idea what those days were. And you know,
Exactly.
You couldn't find out.
No.
Any more than you couldn't put the word rape in the newspaper then. So you would read these strange pieces of journalism, which you would say the woman was found murdered and her head was at some distance from her body, but she had not been interfered with.
Not in any way that matters, anyway.
What is going on in adult life? And I read the word child molester in the newspaper. I had no idea how to pronounce it. I had the same problem with anemone. Anemone.
Yeah,
I still have
say
that problem.
anemone.
Yeah, well, I said child molester. And I thought that it was a job that kids could have. It had to do with catching moles. I knew that there were people who caught worms. You know, you can see them at night if you're in the right place. But so I thought these other people caught moles, and that you could, because they had jobs quite early in life, I thought that maybe this might be a potential job for me. Anyway, you live and learn. The other one I remember was the Lysol ad, which it showed a pool and a woman with her arms up like this in a very dramatic way, and it said, drowning in a sea of hysteria, doubts, and ignorance. You missed that one.
You're a little later than I.
The other one I loved was the mother and her 2 children looking out at the rain, a rainy, dark, and stormy night, and it said, are your loved ones safe tonight? And it was an ad for a concrete coffin enclosing vault. We used to be given magazines when we were ill. You know, that's what you got. You got magazines, the scissors, the paste, and the scrapbook. That's how I saw all of these things.
You were old before your time. James Joyce always said that in the 20th century you can't write about love, or love is not the great drama that it once was, but that it gains something in amiability. I agree with him that I think love stories are no longer possible. So I was very happy when I read The Blind Assassin and absolutely believed the love story and loved it. Do you think it's because of taboo?
I think love stories of the classic kind, which usually meant drama, disappointment, and death of some sort, that kind, there has to be a barrier, of course. So you can't have that kind unless there's a barrier. But when you read the newspapers, you find that these kinds of things are still going on really quite a bit. We did go off to see Titus Andronicus, the play. And I did go with Alice Munro, and she said at the beginning as we were going in, she said, "I've never been to this," and I said, "Neither have I." And she said, I've been reading it. She said, "Surely it's meant to be a farce." And so we went in. I said, "I don't think so." I said, "I don't think it's supposed to be funny." So we went through the first act and we staggered out into the night to have our ice cream bar. And she said, "It's not meant to be funny." She said, it's like the National Enquirer. And these things still go on. The question is, how do you make them into literature? That's the problem. Without being a parody of some kind, or being just silly. And that is a problem.
I don't think Titus Andronicus quite makes it.
No, no, not as a love story.
Or not as anything.
Not as anything. Well, it has a certain. No, you're right. It doesn't. But but it was surprisingly well performed. On the other hand,
if you could stomach it, it's horrible. The Blind Assassin is written from many different perspectives. There's a first-person memoir. There's a set of objective reportage. There is a third-person story about a love affair, which is written from two perspectives, a male one and a female one. And within the love affair, there's another piece of fiction about other people told from an objective standpoint. Tell us why all these refractions exist when, in fact, the entire novel is about one woman.
Well, it gets back to collage, but it also gets back to telling. Who is telling what? And when you have somebody telling, you always have somebody that they're telling it to. Either it's dear reader, dear reader, you alone will share my thoughts. Or somebody within the story is telling it to somebody else within the story. And when my person called Iris Chase Griffin, who is 82, begins to tell, which she has never told before, she's never told. She doesn't know who she's telling to. And part of the novel is her discovery of the person that she feels needs to hear this. Because it is I think any novel is an Ancient Mariner situation. The Ancient Mariner is seized with the need to tell, and he can recognize the person who needs to be told. So there's that connection. And of course, what you always hope when you're a writer is that you write the book, you publish the book, you send it out, and that person who needs the story will find it. That's what you hope. And sometimes that does happen. In fact, it probably happens quite a lot, but you never know that it has happened. You never know. So she's finding out who she needs to tell to. The newspapers and magazine clippings, which are quite short, position the story very quickly in time, because this is a person now of 82 years of age. That's a long time. You can't do every year. It would be a very long book if you did that. So we can jump a bit using that technique, and we can also show what events were going on at the time, which were quite dramatic events. She lived through the First World War, the 20s, the Depression, and the Second World War. Those are the events that shaped the reality that we're still living with now.
Those newspaper clippings were genuine, weren't they?
The newspaper clippings could not be genuine, really, because the people in them are fictional. But the newspapers are real, and that is exactly the kind of thing they go on about.
Because you captured the tone so completely in those clippings that they set the moral universe of the novel in instantly. You didn't have to do anything more. You did more, but you didn't have to. It was a very brilliant device.
Well, thank you. The newspapers themselves were not always amused. So the Toronto Star, whatever world event is going on, it has to have some relation to street repairs in Toronto. For instance.
What's the meaning of the title of The Blind Assassin?
The Blind Assassin. Well, now. The Blind Assassin is, we have a pulp science fiction writer who is the young man in the story, and this is quite accurate. You could make a living if you could write very quickly under different names, writing for the pulps in the 30s. He is telling in order to keep her attention. He's the Scheherazade in reverse. He's spinning out a tale to the woman with whom he is in love. And they can only meet in secret, so he has a different installment at each meeting. She is the person who is susceptible to narrative. So he's doing essentially what Othello does at the beginning of that play. He tells. And he tells a tale that holds her attention. And the tale that he tells is about a blind assassin. And the assassin has become blind because on the planet Zychron, where all of this is taking place, this tale that he has invented, the children weave carpets. The child slaves weave carpets. And because they weave carpets at such an early age, it makes them go blind. People think I make stuff up, Marilyn.
No,
I don't make up almost hardly anything.
Absolutely.
I got that out of the National Geographic. They're
I
tiny
knew
little
in The Handmaid's Tale, every one of those little devices invented to humiliate women actually existed at some point in
history. They've all been done. They've all been done. And even a lot of the other devices not invented to humiliate women, but invented to humiliate other people, they've been done too.
Yeah.
So human history is a big grab bag of improbabilities, which have nevertheless happened. And read the newspaper. I often say to people who don't believe, who think I have a grotesque and twisted imagination, they don't read the papers.
You just have a better memory. They probably try to forget.
I also tear things out of, I have a clippings file.
My last question, and we've discussed this other times. Do you believe in evil?
Do I believe in evil? Do I believe in a person with pointy ears and a tail and horns? Well, no. But I believe in evil, yes, of course. You see it again, of course. You see it manifested. You see evil things happening all the time. And you have to say they are evil.
But I can't believe in it, and you do, and I think this is really interesting.
So you don't believe that it's evil, you think it's just a kind of mistake?
I think that, yes, I think it's a kind of mistake. I don't think anybody intends evil ever.
Marilyn, they do. I'm going to tell you an interesting thing that I read in the newspaper. It's a man who was doing an experiment along these lines, and he devised a game that you can play. And in this game, you can gain money, like Monopoly, pretend money. And you can then deprive other people of the money that they have gained, but you have to sacrifice some of your own money that you have gained in order to do that. And 2/3 of the players will do that. Rather than see the other person have it, they will sacrifice their own in order to make the other person's disappear.
And you don't think that they're convinced they're doing something good?
They're not convinced they're doing something good.
No.
There is.
Well, it's an argument we'll go on having, but I wish you would tell me what you think the nature of evil is.
The nature of evil. Well, the surprising thing to me is that you're more optimistic than I am. I would have thought it would have been the other way around.
I don't think it's optimism. Maybe I have I really believe that we have to be grateful to all the fuck-ups in the world, because it's human helplessness and mistakes and carelessness and inefficiency that is responsible for the fact that we're still here. Because if these guys who set out to conquer the world had been efficient, the world would have disappeared a long time ago.
I think that's probably true.
So I see it more as a set of mistakes and good intentions gone into insanity, that sort of thing.
Maybe I could say I believe in Richard III. Even though Richard III, we know the real Richard III wasn't like that. But when Richard III on the stage speaks, I believe him. When he says, "Watch me."
Just because I was built this way, I'm going to wreck things for everybody else. I don't believe it for a minute.
Not just because he's built that way, but because he's envious. That's it. So maybe evil comes down to envy. And there's a wonderful book about a man who studied as a Western psychiatrist. He was from India. And then he went back to India and looked at the things that they did there. For people with various sorts of problems, which were quite different, and involved shamanism and, sacrificing at the temple of mice and things like that. And there's one culture there in which if somebody falls sick in the village, they believe that it is because somebody else in the village is envious of them. And what you have to do is find the person who is envious and appease them. Make them feel less envious, and then the sick person will get better. But just to conclude on evil, I highly recommend the first Inuit film that has ever been made. It's in Inuktitut. It's called Atanarjuat, the Fast Runner. It's epic in proportion. It's a knockout. It's got a grandmother in it whom you will like. And it begins with evil arriving. And you know what it says? It says, it came from the north.
Of course.
We don't know why.
That's what Marina, what's her name? No, her name's not Marina. The woman who wrote on, the anthropologist who wrote on the European civilizations of 10,000 BC. They were matricentric, they were idyllic, there was no war, there was no killing. And then they came from the north. Those are all my questions, Margaret.
Marilyn, thank you so much.
Thank you.
audience questions. If you can just come to the microphones, we'll take a few questions now.
I'm one of the minority of men here, and I had a recent argument, quite a bitter argument. Excuse me? What did you say?
There you are. There he is. It's okay.
Okay. Anyway, I had a recent argument a bitter argument with my wife, and we looked up uxoricide, wife killing. And then we wanted to see what was the comparable word for husband killing. And we couldn't find it. So if you can shed any light on that, let me know.
What was it?
The question was, they'd had an argument with his wife, and they looked up the word for wife killing, which
Yes,
was uxoricide, and they looked to see if there was a comparable word for husband killing, and they could not find one.
There is one. It's called treason. I'm quite serious. Shakespeare uses it.
Husband killers tend to be slow poisoners. So maybe not quite so dramatic a thing.
Hi, I must preface my question by saying that I'm a great fan of your work, Miss Atwood, and in particular The Handmaid's Tale, which I read 2 months ago. And it was an interesting time to read it 2 months ago, because 2 months ago was post-September 11th, post the establishment of the Patriot Act, which, among many things, sort of conveyed the notion that any of us could be watched at any time for any reason all the time, and amidst discrimination against Arabs and severe media manipulation. And so I was shocked by The Handmaid's Tale. I thought it was so interesting and so relevant, and because of the similarities that I found between its content and your ideas and actual contemporary American society. So I was wondering if you could comment on the relevancy that you see between your ideas and American society within the last few months, and also whether or not you intended your portrayal of the future U.S. to be read as realistic or not.
Well, no. Any society, when it's threatened and thrown into turmoil, has a tendency to trade off individual freedom for safety and control. But I've not been the first person to write about this. When I was 14, approx, or maybe a little younger than that, I read 1984, which had just come out at that time. And that too is a dystopia, and that too involves total surveillance and mind control and those kinds of things. But this is a recurring motif in human history. The most potent combination is the combination of religion and politics. Because then if you object, you're not just a dissident, you're a heretic. And then you get burned at the stake. And if you've looked at all into the doings of the Inquisition and how things went on in those days, or even into the history of witch burning and what have you, people get possessed. I mean, they really do get possessed by a sort of frenzy that they project evil onto other people, and they feel that they have to stamp it out. And I'm a student of the Salem witchcraft trials, among other things. They happen to be near the Canadian literature in the Widener Library at Harvard. So and also, I had a relative involved. But they went through all of that, and then they realized that they'd been had, that they'd been the victims of a mass hysteria, and that they killed a lot of innocent people. And one of the divines talking about this said, we were indeed visited by the devil, but not in the way that we thought. So what you always must try to do under those circumstances is keep your head, not get swept away. However, the middle position is the most vulnerable one, because you can be shot at by both sides. I did notice how hot to trot Mr. Roberts and Mr. Falwell were at that moment. You know, visitation of God, fault of the feminists, fault of the American civil liberties.
Which they retracted.
They had to
shortly.
retract because they didn't get enough takers.
Became clear, yeah.
Yeah, but think of it. If they had had takers for that position, just think of it.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the points of my little fable was, don't get too secure, because anything can happen anywhere given the conditions. And don't let us not believe that we are all somehow exempt from this kind of behavior and this kind of reaction, because we're not. So, did I intend it to be realistic? Yes and no. It begins with a quote from Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, a famous piece of writing in which he proposed a solution to the Irish problem, which would be marketing babies for the purposes of cooking them. And he was, this was heavy irony, but some people believed, thought it was actually quite a good idea. And you do have to watch out for that when you're writing social satire. So the costumes of the Econo wives, no, I didn't mean that to be realistic, though you never know. The general pattern, we can do those kinds of things, and if somebody says that that's what they want to do, give them the power and they'll do it. So if they're saying women should be back in the home, give them the power. How are they going to get those women back into the home? All those women running around using ATM machines and getting up to all kinds of shenanigans. How are you going to get them back into the home? Are you going to just deprive them of the things that they have won over a very short period of time? Really, you're going to do what the Taliban did. Simple. You can't own money, you can't own property, you can't have a job, you can't go outside. You're in the home.
Okay, and in addition, I just wanted to say that it was interesting to hear you say that your work within the U.S. is usually characterized as unpolitical and a sort of personal agenda and therapeutic type of thing, because it seems a very easy way to dismiss the validity of your ideas as something that just applies to you or has come from your imagination rather than something that actually affects everyone.
Can't hear?
Okay. What?
Enough time? Thank you.
I had a question. You mentioned India a couple of times, and someone who's from India had mentioned to me that there are towns where they are kidnapping women because of the problem of letting their female children die so that they should have more sons. And so there are towns that only have sons who now have no one to marry. How is it that a mom in like China or India, do you have an understanding of that? Number one, can let their female children just die? And the second question is there anything that we can do about, or you or someone can do about that? I just don't understand.
It's economic. It's driven by economics and how the economic arrangements go on. In India, with the dowry system, the father is responsible for providing a dowry for each daughter that gets married. So any economist will then tell you that a daughter represents a net economic loss, whereas a son represents a net economic gain to the family. And unless you rearrange that, you are going to have those kinds of feelings that Marilyn probably knows a lot about this. Something we didn't mention is that Marilyn has a book coming out. The first volume is being published in May. It's called From Eve to Dawn, and it is the history of women through the ages. And the first volume, I bet you anything, is going to deal with some of these matters. How did it become that way? How did the situation arise in which women represented a net economic loss and men represented a net economic gain, because it sure ain't like that in hunting-gathering societies. So that's just, I mean, it's a huge problem to be discussed. Marilyn is going to say something about it.
Well, actually, kidnapping is not a problem in India. It's a problem in China, where actually, you know, that according to nature, something like 104 boys are conceived to every 100 girls. And something like 100 boys are born to every 98 girls. But by the time they're a year old, the sexes are equal, because, in other words, boys are more vulnerable for some reason. In places like India and in places like the United States and most of the Western world, women comprise 51% of the population just because of this little vulnerability in the male. But in places like India and certain Arab countries, because they either kill girl babies or malnourish them, the statistics are now about 48 women to 50 men. In China, the proportion has dropped so greatly that men can't find wives, and that's why they kidnap women. And that's a big problem there. I don't know what the statistics are throughout China, but in certain places, there are simply not enough women to marry the men. And you know, most of us think of marriage as something you do for companionship and sex, but in most of the world, marriage is an economic arrangement, and women do all the work. And that's why every man wants a wife, because she keeps him alive. She works so hard. And that's true in gathering societies where women produce 80% of the food. To kill women is, again, a stupidity that results in an evil. But I don't know who thought this up.
Who thought it up?
What you can do about it is get involved. I mean, there are lots of organizations that work on these things. If you care, and you know, if you have the heart to care, then use it.
Thanks.
On a different subject from feminism, one of the many things I admire in your writings is your, seemingly at least, easy, comfortable familiarity with science and scientific concepts and illusions, and not just the kind of women's science, not just biology and anthropology and those sciences, but physics and cosmology and so forth. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, no. I actually got better marks in science in my high school graduating exams, which were the equivalent of university entrance exams. And the reason for that was that they took half a mark off in the English exams for each spelling mistake, and I was not a good speller. So I could spell words like scrofulariaceae, but I couldn't spell words like weird. So the E's and the I's and those things, I fell down on them. I was brought up in a family in which my father was an entomologist, and my brother was a writer, as I was, and a science-interested person, as I was, but the path diverged in the Yellow Wood, and he became a neurophysiologist, and I became a writer. But I retained my interest in science, and he retained his interest in writing and reading. In fact, the first book I published, he read through The Edible Woman and sent me a copy with all the typos marked. So I like to keep up with it. And I've got other relatives. My nephew is a physicist, and we're into the 11 dimensions these days. And so every time I see him, I say, "How's the universe? Any changes?" He brings me up to date. My other nephew is a materials engineer specializing in crystal modeling on computers. And his companion is a forensic anthropologist. Pretty interesting stuff. She used to have a pet. Her father is a bat biologist. And because of all these interests, I'm also somewhat involved in conservation kinds of things, both here and in some other countries. So I read, it's kind of mind candy for me. I don't get into the heavy numbers, but I just like to keep up. I enjoy it, in other words.
Thank you.